From muthos or plot to phronesis or story, an attempt to give some more observations about Dasein, because last time we were trying to go beyond a sort of a dictionary entry where it would say one Dasein, that which you are, two Dasein, that which exists as having its essence be existence, which is one of Heidegger, which is a saying that Heidegger says in one of his seminars, which, however, I'm hesitant even to raise this as though it were obvious, but isn't it obvious in a way that Heidegger, since he's thinking all along, it many times says things which we can't merely say, and this is what Heidegger says straightforwardly, because it matters what kind of reflection he was doing when he made this comment that Dasein is to be understood as the entity which has existence as its essence, which then, because then we're thrown into these questions of are we to understand this as Plato understood it, so that essence corresponds to nous, or the highest activity of the intellect, which after all it doesn't do that much, it just tells us the T, or the quality, the what. The T is the what in Greek. It just tells us, literally, it's just not that easy with the word literal, because literal means literary, really. People say literal all the time, forgetting that it means literary. So there's this factical, immediate confusion of that which a court accepts as factical or de facto, and that which somehow in the back of our mind we think we're saying when we say literal. But the other way to look at this, I think, is to the extent that we're using Dasein in daily life as a word, and we start using the word, and then it becomes something like history, where people talk about their own personal histories, but they mean it somehow in a different way than the history of the world. But then you could also make remarks like he's steeped in the history of ancient Gaul, but has absolutely no sense of what his sensibility is so delicate that he couldn't possibly gain the brutal mentality of the ancient Gaulians themselves, whereas somebody else, therefore, is maybe more linked to the historical Gauls than this scholar who knows all about them, because by their temperament they're more like them, or because by their physicality somehow. And then we see history, when we're looking at more towards the details, it already becomes questionable. But then one could say, yes, there's something we mean by history properly, and then you have to have some idea, some claim about what is history properly. Well, history properly must be the history of states. But if you're Straussian, then state and society are not the terms that Plato used. You're aware that this is a term that, because Louis XIV, that is absolute state, and then people started saying, oh, we're against that absolute state, we represent society, and then that became a constant thing. I mean, just as at a certain time people started talking about power and resistance as the constant slogans, which I think probably happened, I don't know, in the 60s. But what I say is these things change, and they're happening. Some of them are closer to us, some of them are more remote. Okay, let's try to look at Dasein as history. So let's extend that more to Dasein itself. And then One way of thinking about this is think of the ethnos, as Dugan often talks about, and distinguish the ethnos or tribal person from um, uh, the ethos. Somebody is ethos bearing. And this is what I want to call the distinction between the plot or muthos. So the muthos is the ethnos, and the other side of it is the sort of phronesis, or the imagination of a historic. See, we use the word is already like included as a presupposition. We imagine an historically um, literal event, something that happens. So say Socrates. And then because we're part of a tradition, say Socrates talking to the young Plato in um, 405 BC or so. And then you think about these meetings, and then don't we reenact those? So some people deliberately reenact that, which was supposed to be, oh, Socrates was a historically real figure, et cetera, he really existed, these conversations really happened. And therefore you're reenacting something that's supposed to be part of your tradition as a Dasein, as it were. Maybe you wouldn't think that if you weren't from the West. I don't know. Depends on how much you think that you're a part of every Dasein is part of the same cosmos, or whether the center is the country or the culture, or some other way the Dasein is to be given a limit. But this way of giving Dasein a limit is from thinking about to what extent are we conscious of history as something that's affecting us. In one way it's affecting us, as we say, we're the latecomers, the epigons, and they were the ones that had the golden age, or when the thing first came to power. So that one moment philosophy comes to power, and then Nietzsche calls that the first theoretical man, Socrates. And this is a dangerous moment. And then he goes on to mock it, to say, as though we could put this under a specific scientific frame called Hegel's universal history. And he says, oh, this is a choice moment in the universal history. So therefore he sees through that lens as a toy, and he talks from some other position. And I guess that's why his position involves the three histories and their question for Leben, for life. So Nietzsche thinks about that in terms of here's life, it's at the center, just as in Spengler, sometime later. And life gets to decide how these different stories of these different objects. I mean, we have like a spate of renamings around the UC Berkeley campus, for instance, because they're always like the law school. Bolt is declared racist, and then you say, well, we don't want to reenact. That was the actual historical thing that he was doing. Factically, he was doing this and that. We go describe it. He wouldn't rent to blacks or Asians, and you say, oh well, we can't have his name on the building. Because we don't want to reimagine that in our lives, as we want to reimagine the discussion Socrates had with the young Athenians. We do want to reimagine that and live this actual historical event. So there's this back and forth contact with history, right? And that becomes a hyper consciousness with Nietzsche, and that's a big Straussian subject matter too. But it starts with Hegel. The hyper-consciousness of it, they call it historical consciousness. But then you could say, how does it vanish? Where does it go back? And when is it more or less? But we're describing it as something that's a basic part of Dasein. or in a certain way, which tells us what we're investigating when we're investigating Dasein. And so there we have contact with this question. Say, what was it like for a tribe that doesn't have this kind of expectation that there could be geniuses in the future, or thought that something has happened to us in the past? And then you could say they actually do have a past and they know, but what would they mostly be talking about? Like, oh, we had a boar hunt last night and the meat is still there or something. But are they talking about, maybe if they talk about the ancestors, they're probably, when they talk about the ancestors, they would think they're thinking about something timeless. They're not thinking about, these techniques were developed in the past and we could get new style of huts that's more comfortable or more aesthetically choice-worthy. So Heidegger wants to ask whether Dasein, when we really look at it, it involves very heavily this, where that which I just tried to describe is, where, and I think we could see that to some extent in our own lives, especially in terms of age differences, of where the imagination is pulling towards, but the imagination as looking at things which actual historical events, just as or sometimes, that's interesting actually. Sometimes you could, I don't see why you can't. I mean, Lord Byron, I suppose I think it's the myth of Hero in the tower swimming across the Hellespont, and then I forget what the name of the guy was who was swimming across with Hero in the tower, and then Byron wanted to, in life, re-imitate the myth because I suppose it's real to the extent it has the actual geographical place is named. And to reenact what was originally only in the myth. What we're trying to look at is that this is happening somehow. This is happening in Dasein rather than a theory about a brain trying to reach the outside via some kind of taking the senses in through the optic loop and then doing some operations and solving the mind-body problem in the sense of the homunculus and that kind of stuff. We're not trying to do anything like that. We're just looking at what language is telling us. So I guess we could say that, to give it more definition, let me end it this way. We could say, contrasted with the view championed by Bergson, where understanding language not as primarily describing a spatialized zone, which would then be described by the inertial frame of reference ideal. We are looking at what, taken factically in the way we use language, in the rough way we use it in daily life, then we're looking and saying, this is what we mean by the language. And then that's telling us about Dasein.